welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us for today's discussion. We're really excited to have you all here. I'm Sarah Chater, I'm the Principal Investigator of IPPO, and I'm joined by a number of colleagues to discuss today's event on unlocking potential in a crisis, where we're going to be discussing insights into how local authorities responded to the crisis caused by the COVID-19 pandemic. In particular, we'll be looking at how the response to the pandemic, in fact, accelerated policy actions across a number of themes and drove further innovation in policy implementation. But we're also going to be reflecting on some of the constraints and challenges faced and how we might learn from them. A quick bit of housekeeping from me. This meeting is being recorded and we will be uploading it to YouTube afterwards. So please do feel free to share it with colleagues that you know might be interested who weren't able to make today's event. And also a note that we've got quite a lot to get through in an hour. We're keen to make as much time for discussion as possible. So please do use the chat as we go through the meeting and the presentations to capture and post your reflections and comments and questions, and we will pick those up in discussion. Just a quick overview of how today's event is going to work. We're going to start with my colleague Jeremy Williams, who is IPPO's Policy Evidence Lead for Place and Spatial Inequalities, and he will give us a brief overview to the research that we're talking about today. And we'll then hear from Thomas Moniz and Sigrun Clark, who are research fellows at the UCL Rapid Research Evaluation and Appraisal Lab, and they'll be talking us through some of the findings. And then we will hear from colleagues working in local government who've contributed to the research. So firstly, Paul Johnson, who is Head of Policy and Strategic Funding at the South Yorkshire Mayoral Combined Authority, the Economic Development Advisor to the Mayor and the MCA, as well as being the lead officer for Brexit and the COVID-19 response. So he's somebody who knows all about responding to crises. Paul is also one of the co-authors of the region's strategic economic plan and is responsible for the UK Shared Prosperity Fund in South Yorkshire. We'll also hear from Rory Sherwood-Parking, who is the corporate lead for policy and insights at South Tyneside Council and works closely with senior directors and councillors on evidence, policy and profile raising. Most recently, Rory has led a piece of work around poverty. And then finally, we'll move to discussion, which is where we want to hear from you as well. We'll kick off with some reflections from Anthony Breach, who is senior analyst, when I can say the word, at the Centre for Cities. He's based in the research team there and he focuses on housing and planning. So again, some really interesting insights on the more intractable issues in local government and policy making. So please do let us have your comments and reflections as we move through. But for now, I'm going to pass over to Jeremy.
Thanks, Sarah. Thanks, everyone. Great to see so many of you here today. I'm Jeremy Williams, as Sarah says, I'm Policy Evidence Lead for IPPO for Net Zero and Place and Spatial Inequality. I'll talk to you briefly about this piece of work and give you a flavour of the key principles and recommendations, then hand over to Thomas and Sigrun to talk you through the review in itself. So the pandemic hit local governments already in a state of financial pressure. Existing pressures were very strong. And we found, the headline is we found these local governments were able to accelerate innovation and pursue meaningful change as part of their COVID responses. How did they do this? Through collaboration, through increasingly going digital, and through innovative forward-thinking principles, which we'll hear a bit more about in a second. I guess in terms of the recommendations of this report, we have three, two directed mainly to UK government and one more for local authorities themselves, if we see many on this call already. The first one is the need to devolve greater power to local authorities. I think the pandemic response showed that local authorities can benefit from more power being devolved by central government. Also, access to flexible funding opportunities, not ring-fenced, as happens indeed already with levelling up funding. And finally, local authorities themselves should prioritise increased collaborative working, both with the third sector, business, and the parts of society, as well as between authorities themselves to pool resources going forward. So that's our kind of key headlines and recommendations. I'll hand over now to Thomas and Sigrun to talk us through the review itself.
So yeah, hi, we're from the Rapid Research Evaluation and Appraisal Lab. So this work was led by Thomas Moniz and my name is Sigrun Clark, and we'll be presenting a few slides to summarise our findings from the policy review. So we ended up including 28 recovery plans in our review that were relatively diverse in terms of their regional spread, political status, level of deprivation and population size. And we included London authorities, combined authorities, metropolitan districts, unitary councils, county councils and district councils. We also conducted in-depth case studies with a sample of the authorities included in our review. So we interviewed key stakeholders that may have been involved in the development or implementation of the plans to get a greater understanding of their experiences of doing this in response to a crisis and the challenges and facilitators that they faced in the process. So to summarise some of our findings, We found that most of the recovery plans touched on net zero, place and spatial inequalities, socio-economic inequalities, the economy and business, young people, and health. And we've listed some examples on this slide of the common plans, and this included retrofitting homes and developing zero carbon new builds, developing 15-minute neighbourhoods with all necessities located within a 15-minute walk or cycle to residents, and improving digital access to those who are often excluded through improved infrastructure, grants, and training. And then we've also got enhancing job creation, providing skills and employment support to young people, and investing in training for the health and social care sector. So a finding that we noticed from all of the stakeholders interviewed was that the policy plans that were produced were not completely novel. Instead, they were often based on previous plans that needed to be accelerated in the COVID recovery climate. And the common areas that were targeted for acceleration due to the pandemic included improved digital connectivity and inclusivity, increased focus on the climate and access to green spaces, and increased focus on addressing inequalities. And I'll pass over to Thomas.
Thank you for that, Sigrun. So now moving on to collaboration and engagement. So one of the key findings from our research was that under the collective imperative created by the COVID-19 pandemic, there was a shift towards more collaborative forms of working, as you can see from the case study quotes at the bottom of the slide. Now, this shift occurred both within local authorities, between different departments, as well as across different local authorities, between different departments, and between different local authorities, coming together to pool resources and create shared plans. Collaboration included working with local enterprise partnerships, chambers of commerce, public service providers such as transport, health, alongside voluntary and community sector bodies, local businesses, and the public. Recovery responses involve substantial joint working and the uptake of whole systems approaches, with case studies highlighting the importance of maintaining this beyond the COVID context. This is exemplified in London, where the GLA and London councils, the umbrella body for the London boroughs, came together to create the London Recovery Board, a wide-ranging group to steer COVID recovery and coordinate governance bodies, business unions, and the third sector. This has since been retained in the post-pandemic context as the London Partnership Board, seeking to seize upon the shift to collaborative working in the long term. Now, moving on to the issue of funding. In recent years, as you'll be well aware, local authorities have been facing mounting financial constraints. This has been exacerbated by the pandemic and the subsequent rising demand for socio-economic services. Our findings reveal that funding requests were a core element of the recovery plans, with many local authorities lacking the resources to fully fund their implementation. Some of the plans were actually framed as investment asks and explicitly reference that implementation depends on securing further government funding. Ultimately, it appears that many of the recovery plans were not fully funded and the scope of implementation was limited. The funding that was received came from a variety of different sources, including government COVID support, as well as the Levelling Up Fund, UK Shared Prosperity funding, the Getting Building Fund, leftover EU development funds, and local authorities' own funding streams. Across the case studies, the issue of funding was raised in relation to ring-fenced, time-bound, and competitive funding, with the flexibility of funding being raised as very important to enable the pivoting and blending of funding in order to target multiple outcomes. Now, this leads us on to the issue of devolution. England's system of local governance appears to be characterized by a sort of patchwork multi-level network of local authorities. These are often overlaid with divergent geographical boundaries for public service delivery, such as transport, health, policing, and result in administrative fragmentation and complexity. The UK government remains central to the arrangements and relationships that comprise the overall local government system in England, and local authorities are clearly dependent on the central government for funding and restricted in how they can use that funding. There was a recognition across the case studies that with greater devolution for local authorities, those with greater contextual knowledge of what is needed to enable local recovery and policy change would have access to more funding and a greater responsibility to decide on the appropriate deliverables for their communities, as is illustrated by the quote below. This leads us on to our principles for the future. Now, drawing on the findings from the research, we would like to recommend 3 broad principles, which Jeremy touched on, for the UK government and local authorities to enable greater policy innovation, especially when crises demand swift changes in ways of working. First of all, the UK government should devolve greater powers to local authorities, including giving them the increased ability to determine how to use existing funding and to raise additional funds in order to pursue their strategic local priorities. This is in line with the government's levelling up strategy, which explicitly states that by 2030, all areas of England that want a devolution deal will have one. Secondly, the UK government should ensure that local authorities have access to more flexible funding opportunities that are not time-bound, ring-fenced, or competitive, as was one of the criticisms of the Levelling Up Fund. This would help prevent local authorities spending time and resources developing funding bids that are ultimately unsuccessful. Finally, local authorities should prioritize increasing collaborative working. This includes seeking input from local businesses, services, and community groups, as well as publics, to develop their strategic plans. In particular, where a crisis requires shifts in policy change, swift change and adaptation. It is essential to include all interlocking levels of governance in developing collective strategic responses. To that same effect, local authorities should employ greater community engagement exercises to ensure that the work being done also reflects the interests and needs of the local community, in line with the government's aim to improve pride in place and trust in local government. Thank you very much for listening to our presentation. We hope it has provided some insights into how the pandemic and the development of recovery plans have enabled policy acceleration and organisational change.
Thank you very much, Sigrun and Thomas. Some real food for thought there. I hope you all found that interesting, and I hope you're all now busily reacting and reflecting and formulating questions on some of those findings and insights. While you're doing that, we'll now move to Paul Johnson to offer his perspective. He was part of the research that Sigrun and Thomas have just talked you through. And as I said, Paul is Head of Policy and Strategic Funding at the South Yorkshire Mayoral Combined Authority. Paul, can we go to you, please?
Yeah, thanks, Sarah. Afternoon, everyone. And yeah, thanks to Thomas for engaging in the research and asking us to be part of it. It was really interesting, and the results show that. So yeah, as Sarah outlined, I work for South Yorkshire Mayoral Combined Authority. Just rolls off the tongue, doesn't it? And I guess in terms of in South Yorkshire response to the pandemic, it was very much a joint effort between the combined authority and the 4 local authorities, working very much as 5 equal partners with that. Before getting to the South Yorkshire response, I think my main reflection really was in terms of lots of, I guess, public sector providers rightly got a lot of praise in terms of response to the pandemic. I actually think local government, particularly the local authorities, were remitted from that in terms of what my experience of the local authorities, particularly in South Yorkshire, that I work closely with, in terms of people working really long hours, doing it on top of their jobs in terms of getting those grants to businesses really quickly. I thought it was the public sector and specifically the local government working at its best, and there was a lot of collaboration. And yeah, I just wanted to note that really. And I think especially if you think of the context of the decade previous to that of austerity and I guess the emergency planning functions of local authorities pretty much being cut down to the bone. And I know in South Yorkshire, from our perspective, I worked with the South Yorkshire Local Resilience Forum, and that was all your different public sector funders, and they worked tirelessly together, and that was helping people with the fire service or the health or the police or whoever at that stage. I really thought it was the best of the public sector. Not there's many good things to come out of the pandemic, but I think in terms of public sector collaboration and how well everyone worked together, I do think that was a genuine positive and something that I've seen locally in South Yorkshire that's carried on to this day. So yeah, in South Yorkshire, I think in terms of the timing of it, in terms of collaboration and working together and strategy, we were all just before the pandemic hit, we were quite well on the way with developing our strategic economic plan. And that was definitely a shift in terms of the policy, but I guess also the approach. I think when we did the previous one, when in the history of South Yorkshire, when it was the LEP was established in 2014, it was quite technocratic, top down. I don't think it was that collaborative. And the previous economic plan was pretty much just written by the combined authority in the LEP, whereas this strategic economic plan, I think the local authorities will back me up on this if they were on the call. It was very much jointly produced. It was very collaborative, and they had much more ownership because of that. Now, when we're doing our response to COVID, we developed a renewal action plan, which I spoke to Thomas about as part of the research. And this very much built on what we already had in the strategic economic plan. I won't go into detail too much about it, but it was very much framed around being stronger in terms of our economy, greener related to net zero, and fairer in terms of creating more opportunities for our people. So that was reflected in our plan. And I think those recent existing improvements, I'd say, in terms of our relationships with local authorities, and also the timing, I guess, specifically in South Yorkshire with the devolution deal was finalised in 2021, and it's just there's definitely a more collaborative approach. I think the response to COVID of everyone working tirelessly together did actually accelerate that and help it. And that has continued to this day. I think there's been our approach. We've definitely got guiding principles of acting at the right kind of level. I think there's a time for combined authorities, especially about finding where they add value. I think an example of that is in business support. I think maybe sometimes, being honest, some of the criticisms, it was maybe not always adding value, maybe duplicating slightly some of the services that local authorities already offered with their business support. Whereas I felt with the response to the pandemic in terms of this, we were trying to focus on, right, okay, if the local authorities are doing that on business support, what can the combined authority focus on to add value? And that was reflected in our plan in terms of really trying to help our businesses adapt and then also thrive in the future. And the other big part of it was there was a lot allocated towards skills. And I think my main reflection on that was from when we wrote the plan to then moving towards implementation. Actually, when we were writing it in 2020, there was a lot of doomsday scenarios, particularly around the economy and what the unemployment crisis could have been. Thankfully, due to a lot of government support, that didn't materialise. So actually, I think this is my reflections on this. It was great working together, but we actually were a bit more adaptive in terms of what the funding went on to because the labour market was very different to what people originally expected. So our funding then changed to reflect that. And so initially, when we were writing the plan, there was going to be a lot of helping people back to work and getting people off unemployment, whereas actually what happened, it was quite different. So it's more about equipping people for future jobs, and the labour market is some of the challenges we face now aren't the unemployment crisis we maybe thought in 2020. So it's maybe become a bit more targeted. In South Yorkshire, we've got issues with people with ill health trying to access jobs. So we've actually ended up targeting some of the skills interventions a bit more than we initially said. Now, I think a big reflection on that, in my view, is, I guess, the government and the whole country's approach to devolution and funding. The positive of this in terms of our funding for our response to the pandemic was we didn't have the usual strings attached to government funding with all in terms of I work on the UK Share Prosperity Fund and the joys of that. If anyone on the call is working on it in terms of the very specific outcomes you've got to do, and even though it has been devolved, it's still very much run as a scheme by Westminster and delivered in the regions, but we still got to, I guess, dance the government's tune on that. Whereas if you have true devolution with funding that where you've not got as much direction and it's not as directive, you can actually tailor it a bit more to your local circumstances more effectively, and you can also be more adaptive, which we have been with this. And I think it just illustrated to my perspective, if we move towards true devolution that comes with funding and as well as the responsibilities that come with that, you can actually target the groups and make it more place specific, and that's what we've done. And this kind of how we adapted, I say, what was in the original plan to what we've done. We've managed to move some of our, say, business investment that was, we've managed to change that a little bit to focus more on acceleration, because we've tried to, as the 5 partners in South Yorkshire, trying to move more towards policies that can support our entrepreneurs to prosper. So that has been a real benefit, I guess, of our approach. So we wrote our renewal action plan as our response to the pandemic. But like the labour market changed, the economy changed. It wasn't maybe as severe as we thought. And I think in South Yorkshire, maybe slightly different to some areas in terms of the economic impacts, in terms of we didn't have as much employment in some of the sectors such as tourism and leisure that were the most affected by the pandemic. And we also have strengths in sectors such as logistics and construction, where people could still work. So people that may be furloughed or were seeking employment could still find secondary employment whilst the pandemic was going on. So things maybe from an economic perspective weren't quite as bad as we maybe thought from that action plan. But because
thank you, I'm conscious of time.
Sorry.
No, that's super interesting. Is that a good moment to pass on to Rory, and then perhaps we can pick some of that up in the discussion?
Thanks, Sarah.
Thank you so much. Rory, over to you.
Thank you very much, Sarah, and thanks again for the invitation. I'm Rory Sherwood Parkin, Corporate Lead for Policy at South Tyneside Council, and I've got a couple of slides just to talk you through our response to the pandemic and some of the learnings from that. So hopefully you can see that okay. So South Tyneside is in the northeast of England, population of about 150,000 people, cover the key towns of South Shields, Jarrow and Hebburn. So anyone that's done the Great North Run, South Shields is where you finish, and we are Beach of the Year according to the Sunday Times. So I have to get that into every single presentation that I do. But just to tell you a little bit around our economic recovery plan, which is one of the case studies within this research, and crucially, I think what we've done since, the fact that it's kind of accelerated a lot of our plans. So back in the autumn of 2020, so right in the heart of the pandemic, we produced the document you can see on the left-hand side. So that's our economic recovery plan for the borough. And South Tyneside, amazing place, amazing coastal community, but we do have some real entrenched, deep-rooted issues, particularly around employment levels, poverty, deprivation, skills and health. So some real difficult challenges to overcome. And I think the pandemic really shone a light on some of those very entrenched challenges. So what we did was to try and focus our economic recovery plan and all of our activity in the autumn of 2020 on three main levers, which you can see on the right-hand side there. So very similar to what Paul described. So around productivity, particularly in relation to skills. Secondly, that kind of pivot towards the green economy. And given we're a coastal community and we've got the Port of Tyne in our patch, real opportunities around offshore wind in particular to grasp. And then finally, that kind of concept around inclusive growth and really kind of positioning our recovery in terms of reducing inequality. So we had three real strong kind of focuses within our economic recovery plan, and that's led you can tell I like loads of nice pictures and colours. That led to us creating a new vision for South Tynes. So it accelerated some of the work which you're already thinking about. And you'll see there our new vision for the borough, which we produced last year, all around 5 key ambitions. So making sure residents are financially secure, given the issues we have around poverty, the fact that the pandemic shone a light on some of those inequalities. Secondly, the importance of being healthy and well, again, given the impact of the pandemic and the need to kind of focus on things like the best start in life. I think really importantly, and this is one of the key lessons for us from the pandemic, was to move from a bit of an obsession maybe with projects more towards people. So our vision for the next 20 years and all of our work has been focused much more on residents and the people of the borough rather than on kind of big shiny capital projects, of which we did a lot previously, but a real strong move towards people, hence that focus on connection to jobs. That kind of sense of place in terms of being part of strong communities, and then finally that really explicit targeting support to make things fairer. So the first time we've really had that focus on reducing inequality and poverty. And then some of the images you'll see around the screen are really to emphasise the kind of partnership working that we've put in place since that original economic recovery plan. So the the South Tyneside Pledge in the top right-hand corner is our community wealth building project. We've got over 250 now organisations signed up across public, private and voluntary sector to focus on the borough. So that's things like local procurement, local recruitment, local volunteering, all the way down to our focus on working with NHS colleagues around winter readiness in the bottom left-hand corner, our vision for the town centre in South Shields in the bottom right-hand corner, and received levelling up funding from government yesterday on that. And then our welcoming places, which were a network of warm spaces we set up last winter, a kind of multi-agency approach to tackling the cost of living crisis, for which we've carried on over the previous few months. And then just to sum up in terms of some of the challenges and learning and opportunities from the recovery plan and the work that we've done over the past 3 years, I think, as colleagues have mentioned, really difficult to kind of create and develop a plan when we didn't know what the long-term impacts might be of what we were looking at. And I think to a certain extent that's still unknown, particularly around the kind of impact on young people and upon mental health. And you can see that playing through in terms of economic inactivity rates and how to create a plan which should start to tackle some of those really long-standing, deep-rooted issues I talked about at the start. But just as Paul touched upon, I think that importance of collaboration and partnership working really shone through the response to the pandemic, and we've really looked to kind of build on that through things like the pledge, which I mentioned, the fact that we've moved our kind of COVID leadership board now is a cost of living leadership board to kind of respond to some of the cost of living crisis issues, and taking a much more of a partnership approach, and to the last point on there, a much more of a kind of co-production approach. So a lot of work we've been doing with adult social care colleagues has been around co-production and developing plans with people and having that voice of lived experience. And then the middle bullet point there, that recognition, I think, which came through the pandemic, that about the social determinants of health. So it's not just, if we're thinking about the economy, it's not just about supporting businesses or looking at skills, it's about health, it's about housing, it's about all those underlying issues as well. And I think that the final point I'd make, Sarah, was just to be brave. I think we've tried really hard since the pandemic to kind of go for it, to think, we want to come up with really exciting visionary plans for South Tyneside and to kind of go for it. And so I'd encourage people to do that. Hopefully that's useful.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Rory. What a lovely point on which to end on, an injunction to us all to be braver. Very shortly, it will be over to you. I think we've had some really interesting insights there into the different strands of response. I'm particularly struck, I suppose, by those structures and governance approaches that have now been sustained and adapted and continued in current circumstances. I'd quite like to ask all of you joining us online examples of where you have seen other responses to the pandemic done well, done badly, things that struck you as particularly important. And please do share those in the chat. While you're chewing on that, I'd love to turn to Anthony Breach now to start us off on our discussion.
Terrific. Thank you, Sarah. So local government is really important in the recovery and beyond it. I think, we've seen over the past few years, even as turmoil has engulfed Westminster and there's been all manner of distractions for MPs and for ministers and for journalists, local and combined authorities have really been getting on with the job of providing services and looking to improve their place and the country. I think this is a great report, a really comprehensive range of interviews and research that really shows that happening all across England. And I think the recommendations, you're looking at more devolution, more flexible funding, and more cooperation are really interesting. And anyone who is close to the ground, understands that these are really important, not just for local government and the things that local government cares about, but also for achieving a bunch of better policy outcomes across health, across the economy, and across all manner of things. I'd like to sketch a bit of a roadmap as to how we can achieve these, but also to help put these plans into action, which means considering this from Whitehall's perspective. We know the UK is very centralised, and the ball's unfortunately in Whitehall's court when it comes to discussions on some of these kinds of reform. So I think the thing is, when national civil servants here, the kind of overriding that's dominating their minds and their thinking is that the national economic situation is really quite dire, that the economic model that the UK has is really stuck, and figuring out how, and public finances as well, are also extremely constrained in the way that they haven't been for decades. So figuring out how we can increase national economic growth number 1, 2, and 3 for civil servants. So an implication of that for local government is there's unfortunately not then going to be a return to the kind of period of generous grant funding that we saw before the period of austerity, even though we all understand that greater resource for local government is crucial for advancing a whole bunch of not just local goals, but also for national policy goals. There's going to have to be a different approach to what we've done in the past. So it seems to me there's a few different things. I think if we're thinking about getting the recommendations of the report done, and improving the situation for local government and getting those recommendations really done. I think the first is that it's kind of a question of priorities, right? So any discussions with Whitehall, whether that's kind of through the county deals which are being negotiated, or kind of for more kind of mood music, like the discussions with the civil service and with national government, we need to be about how the changes that are being proposed are about improving local economic growth and thereby national economic growth. So there are other priorities which are really important to local government, which are in the domain of local government, but they unfortunately aren't currently a priority for Whitehall given that national economic situation. Second, I think in return for an increase of funding within the funding system, which is kind of one problem which I think everyone here recognises needs to change, there's also a second question about how we design that funding system. So what we see is that, our research center for cities, we've done some stuff on this recently, is that the design of the funding system that we currently have is a really big barrier to local growth and thereby to national economic growth as well. So figuring out how we can actually give more tax powers back to councils, back to local government from when they were taken away in 1988, and figuring out how we can improve the incentives of councils to pursue growth, so to keep more resources and rewards from local growth in return for more funding in the funding system, is something that Whitehall is interested in, and will be at the core, I think, of any kind of discussions about how we get that increased flexibility and also that increased autonomy for councils as well. But I think kind of the third thing, if we want that more resource and we think that fiscal devolution is an important way to get it done, we also really need to be thinking about how we can create geographies that can absorb fiscal devolution, both in a capacity and in a power sense, but also to mitigate, to prevent any increase in inequality that might emerge from greater autonomy over local taxation. So that in turn, means thinking about taking some tough choices about devolution deals and being prepared to make some difficult reforms at the local level. But those are the sort of changes that Whitehall is going to be looking for if it's going to counterbalance big changes to the funding system and to what local government is responsible for, and transfer competencies out of Whitehall back to local government where they belong. So obviously, that's a lot there, right? None of this is easy, but I think the report's a really great launchpad for discussion on this. And we know that getting this right matters, not just for for local places, but also for the country as a whole, as local government is really important, not just in the recovery, but beyond as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Anthony. And thank you indeed to all our speakers for kicking off such an interesting discussion. Really interesting to reflect on the inherent tension there between the central drivers from Whitehall and how local government can respond, or indeed is constrained in its response. I'd be very interested, those of you joining online, if you could think about your views on the 3 principles that have been identified as part of this research. So around greater devolution, the need for more flexible and non-competitive funding, and around collaborative working. I'm going to kick off our discussions with a question to our panel of speakers, asking them really to think about those questions of devolution. And in your view, what additional knowledge, capacities, resources are necessary for local authorities to be able to make best use of any additional devolved powers or devolved fiscal responsibilities? And perhaps reflecting a little bit, given the topic of today's event, on in particular how we can ensure that local government is as best equipped as possible to respond to future crises. Can we go first of all to you, Paul?
Yeah, in terms of, I think links back to an earlier point I made, really, of just general capacity to cope with this, because a lot of what happens is this just gets in combined authorities and local authorities, in terms of things like devolution, this often just becomes an add-on to what they're already doing. So people can't focus on it enough as maybe they need to. And in terms of, future crises, again, I mentioned earlier about in terms of emergency planning functions being cut, and I think there was a lot of preparation that I think did go on in the lead up to the pandemic. And I think all the lessons we've learned of one, working together, and I think focusing on resilience. I think we're focused on particularly on that in terms of economic resilience, not always just about growth. And I think in terms of local authorities needing more capacity, and I say local authorities, county councils, whatever system is in place, combined authorities. I think in terms of that function, in terms of developing policy that works across regions, that is in terms of building economic resilience before we go into it. I think that just needs more capacity. And I think with devolution, there's an opportunity, particularly around health. And I think the pandemic illustrated the inextricable link between economy and health. And I think in terms of how we move forward with devolution, that could be an interesting area, I would suggest, of all areas pursuing that, of how they can, particularly economic sides, and in terms of how we can, I guess, because obviously NHS covers a lot of that, but how local government can work on preventative health. And I think in terms of getting more capacity and knowledge into that, and better partnership working with the NHS as well and other health authorities. We've seen that in South Yorkshire with our mayor taking a lead. And I think that cross-working, I think, between local government and health partners, of how we can better work together for economic but also health outcomes together. And I think in devolution, that'd be a really good opportunity to pursue.
Brilliant. Thanks, Paul. And that seems to chime a little bit with what you were saying earlier, Rory, around the social determinants of health cutting across almost everything you're doing now, as I understood it.
Completely agree. I think Paul's spot on with that analysis. I think for us, back to the point I think you made around being a bit of a patchwork quilt in terms of geographies, we're in that kind of situation where our integrated care board, so the new NHS governance, covers 14 local authorities. We're part of a combined authority that will come into place next May, which will be 7 local authorities. So you've got all these different overlapping geographies, which I don't think helps. I also think central government need to, as per your report, let go a bit more, so a bit more trust and freedom for local authorities and combined authorities. I share Paul's pain around UK shared prosperity funds, for example, where it's kind of not proper devolution, it's kind of half-hearted devolution. So we need that kind of proper devolution of powers. And I'd say definitely agree on the health side. I'd say on the employment support side too. So some of those powers that DWP have, if we could have a more kind of localized version of that to be able to support people with a proper kind of employment and health program to help support people back into work, I think that would work really nicely. So I guess it's about those layers, isn't it? Those kind of hyperlocal or ability to do things at a hyperlocal level, and having that trust from central government when it comes to devolution.
Brilliant, thank you. Anthony, any reflections from you on that point, particularly given that tension you were highlighting for us?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, you know, because obviously kind of at the local level, right, there are going to be these, you know, local priorities that, you know, local government officers, you know, local members are going to know better than anyone, right? It's their patch. You know, so someone in Whitehall is going to see that stuff on a spreadsheet. You know, if they notice it, right, it's not going to be a top priority for them, whereas always for people in local government, you know, improving, you know, the living standards and improving the health outcomes of the people who they exist to serve is always going to be the top priority. I think there's then working out how we give the competencies and also have the funding and also the funding system to enable local government to set its own priorities, right? Because sometimes there's going to be chicken and egg problems that have to be solved in ways that you know, are not necessarily obvious from central government's perspective, or even necessarily from the local authorities at first blush. But you know, moving towards a system in which we have more autonomy, you know, stronger local government with greater capacity, and you know, a mandate to really tackle some of these problems, economic in nature, but also social. You know, it is really important, not just for you know, improving the kind of things that local government cares about, but again, it's these things of national significance that play out every day in places across the country.
Great, thank you. We've had lots of comments in the chat now with examples of different activities focused on engaging communities, which is really quite positive. I think an equal blend of excitement at what's been possible and a bit of depression at what may now be coming to an end. I wonder if I could ask you all, we've had a question from Guldag, who's interested in examples of specific community engagement projects that you've developed. And I might come first to Sigrun and Thomas to see if there's anything they would want to highlight from the case studies that they did as part of the research.
There were various that were raised across the research at different levels of government. For example, I know that Adder and Worthing district, in their plan, they discuss creating an environmental forum for their residents, sort of create more of a democratic assembly to sort of decide around the policies on that. And I'm also aware of the GLA, the Greater London Authority, on their London Recovery Programme. They engaged extensively with the residents of London through various different platforms.
Great, thank you. And over to you, really, Rory, Paul, perhaps in particular. Any examples you particularly like to flag from the work you're doing in South Tyneside and South Yorkshire?
I'll jump in. So I think in terms of ours, in terms of our initial response to the pandemic, it was very much gearing up towards the transition to net zero. Since the pandemic, actually, we've had a new mayor, and he's been really keen on that, but also how we do democracy differently and how we engage different people. We've just started a citizens' assembly for climate change, and that has completely revolutionised how we develop policy, how we engage different people, different communities. Because I think before we were, to be honest, quite technocratic and didn't do that as much engagement, whereas the pandemic showed to reach the most vulnerable groups and different perspectives, you do need to do that thorough engagement, and that's what we're trying to do. So that's one of the positives. But yeah, the Climate Assembly, we just had our second workshop on that with the 100 people that signed up to it. It's been really encouraging start, and trying to, I guess, yeah, illustrating how we're trying to develop policy in a different way.
Thanks. Rory, anything to add?
I suppose 3 quick examples from us, and I don't think we've by any means cracked this in terms of kind of consulting with residents or bringing the voice of lived experience into what we do. But I'd say we've done a recent large consultation of residents in South Shields Town Centre, starting off with a blank page around how we want to regenerate the town. So over 1,500 responses to that, and that's really helped shape what we're looking to deliver. Secondly, we had a network of cost of living champions, kind of community champions during the pandemic, and we've carried that on as health champions and grown that network, which has really helped us reach out into communities that we hadn't really talked to before. And then thirdly, again, I have to get this into every single council presentation, the South Tyneside Pledge, which is all about working with businesses and voluntary sector and big kind of anchor organisations in the borough to keep things local. So we're quite proud of that. That's our kind of community wealth building initiative to kind of keep money in the local economy, encourage more volunteering and links between those 3 sectors.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. We've had another question from Lily Madavi about a devolution, and I think 2 aspects on it. One, which is how to ensure that it doesn't lead to fragmentation across the country. So I might come to you to deal with that, Anthony. But also, I think, picking up the opportunities that have come forward very clearly from all of you, I think, about the value of collaboration, in particular in terms of sharing learning and best practice. So perhaps if we could start with you, Anthony, to pick up the fragmentation point, and then I'll move on. Yeah, so Lily's 100% right? That is, the £64,000 question, right? How do you advance devolution without creating fragmentation? Because the current structure of local government, as we know, I think it's been sort of hinted at in the reports and discussion today, is incredibly higgledy-piggledy, right? It's not even that it's very fragmented, it's also very varied in its fragmentation, right? You can get very different types of structure and balance of responsibilities depending on where you are in the country. And I think if we take a step back and we think about what are we trying to do in terms of devolution, especially with economic focus, we would argue at centre cities that priorities should be about thinking, how can we align political geographies with economic geographies? Because that gives you the best chance that actually local leadership and local politics can then, by governing a coherent local economy, a commuter area, kind of a graduate commuter area in which people live and where they work, and where you see differences between different parts of the country in economic performance, that gives you the best chance to transfer powers to the local level with the expectation that local and national growth will improve.
and also that you have a shift from national redistribution down to local redistribution, so from between different parts of the country to within different parts of the country, which then allows you to do the fiscal devolution and improve the connection between local resource and improvements to the local economy. So what that means, better aligning political geography with economic geography is then coming back to this question about the map and the devolution process at that local level. I think in practice that means moving towards something like the Redcliffe Maud map of 1969, where you had big, large unitaries that corresponded to local economies outside the big cities, and then two-tier, metro mayors on top of boroughs within the big cities. We've got some kind of evolving thoughts on this, but it really does mean, I think, kind of grasping the nettle and saying, it's merging districts and counties together around economic geographies gives you the best bet against in a constitutional system where Parliament really has unlimited powers to take away power from local government, creating a strong base for local government that represents coherent economies and can absorb these powers and keep these powers is really, really important for the system as a whole to avoid that fragmentation.
Thank you, Anthony. Rory and then Paul, I wonder if I can come to you to reflect on that, but perhaps also picking up that point about the opportunities for shared learning through collaboration. And then I'm going to ask Sigrun and Thomas to reflect on their sense of the opportunities from collaboration, which they picked up in the research.
I think from our point of view, it's a really interesting one in the northeast around devolution at the moment. There's a metro mayor in the North of Tyne combined authority, which is 3 of the local authorities north of the River Tyne and Weir south. So from next May, that small combined authority will become one larger one of 7, which makes a lot of sense, as Anthony was saying, from a kind of travel to work, travel to learn point of view. And we are really excited about some of the powers, particularly around transport and housing, that this could unlock. I guess there's a slight nervousness from our point of view, being one of the smallest local authorities, a small urban area in contrast to big cities who will be in that patch, such as Newcastle and Sunderland and Durham, and the potential risk that we're slightly left behind or overshadowed by those. But I think that's on us, our leadership, our politicians, to kind of fight that case and to make sure that we can join up across the 7. So huge opportunities, I think, for that collaboration. And I do think actually from COVID we worked together really well as a 7 local authorities and the combined authority, and we've got those really strong relationships at both the officer level and a kind of senior politician level that we can build on. And I think I used to work for, I won't name them, I used to work for combined authorities kind of 10 years ago. I think since that point, certainly my experience in the north of the northeast is that a lot more grown-up conversation. It's not a kind of bun fight between the 7 anymore. It's a lot more about what's the best for the northeast. So that fills me with a lot of confidence.
Thanks. And Paul?
Yeah, thanks. And I'd echo that as well. Even my experience of working in South Yorkshire, the combined authority, has seen that evolution really of the relationships, and I think of true collaboration. And actually, I think what's important, what I found in South Yorkshire anyway, is almost finding your purpose as well of what to focus on, particularly around growth. All the 4 local authorities and the combined authority are obviously agreed about that, but in terms of us, it's kind of like, what is the MCA going to focus on? And maybe we've agreed that's going to be more like innovation-led growth and focus on kind of the businesses. If we're going to do business support, let's focus the MCA's funding on where we can help businesses to scale up and to. So I think of rather duplicating what maybe some of the local authorities offer. And in terms of building on Anthony's point, in terms of devolution, I guess the current local authority setup and the whole local government across the country, the current system we've got, no one would design it right now if you're starting from scratch, but this is what we've got. So let's try and make it work. And I think I completely echo the point. I think focusing on functional economic areas, wherever that is, if that's different in a rural area or an urban area, whatever it is, economies don't follow local authority boundaries. So I think in terms of working together and trying to focus on that, whatever you've got, just make it work. And I think that leadership, if you've got a directly elected mayor or whatever's in place in terms of devolution, I think that can be really important. I've seen that in South Yorkshire in terms of what we're trying to do at the moment with our mayor, in terms of he's leading a collaborative effort in terms of what we're trying to do with investors and funding partners. We're working with Innovate UK, British Business Bank, UK Infrastructure Bank, about how we can better that whole funding ecosystem. And it's much easier when you've got that political leadership to bring those big national organisations and funders together into a local regional setting. And I think that's the opportunity that devolution can unlock. And in terms of, if you're getting more powers, but also you got to get more responsibilities for that, and that's what you get with directly elected mayors. So I mean, I would say that looking for combined authority, but I've seen the benefits of it, and I think so whatever structure you've got, let's not tear it up and start all over again. Because just go back to 2010 with the RDAs. I think it's kind of let's focus on devolution and working together and the benefits that can bring.
Really interesting, thank you. It's also interesting, I suppose, to think about some of the other ecosystems within regions. I'm thinking, because I work in a university and I'm interested in how to connect university research to policy, but I'm thinking about the knowledge ecosystem that you both sit in South Tyneside and in Yorkshire. And in fact, you are both quite close to fairly significant regionally focused university policy engagement initiatives that are developing almost as we speak, which is an interesting thing to think about, particularly from the perspective of sharing learning. Sigrid and Thomas, can we come to you? And then we'll try and do one last question very quickly, but just your insights in terms of the research on where there are opportunities in terms of collaboration and sharing practice across authorities.
There's opportunities for collaboration across all levels of governance. And that, I mean, it was something that was evident across all levels of governance. So with district councils coming together to pool resources and shared plans as they realize that they see themselves as an extension of the same community, and so that makes more sense as opposed to duplicating work. This was the same in London with the South London Partnership, which came together to create a plan which contributed towards the GLA's plan, or worked towards the same missions. It was aligned. But I also think that there's opportunities on issues, because the pandemic showed that there was no area that was untouched by the pandemic. And so because it cut across so many issues that require this coming together of a whole system approach, we need to look at this from so many different perspectives. And so we need all these different people in the same room, as was demonstrated by the London Recovery Board. So you had, the police and health and all these different people in the same room having conversations that they wouldn't normally have, which creates connections that wouldn't otherwise be able to be made. I think there's also, a lot of opportunity around collaboration, specifically around combined authorities. The West Midlands case study specifically raised that it was really sort of a proving point, a milestone, the pandemic, in proving the value of combined authorities as being able to convene, all other actors within their area. And so that was an important point for them. But also it was an important point because as a combined authority, they have specific value, as Paul has mentioned, with regard to business support and economic strategy, and that enabled the local authorities to focus on more societal aspects of the recovery.
All right, thank you so much. We are nearly out of time, but I'm keen we get to a last question that Veronica Kinting-Lee has put in the chat, which essentially boils down to, are we ready for a potential new wave of COVID this winter? And what are we doing about long COVID and the longer term impacts, which takes us right back to where this research started, which is understanding responses to the pandemic. I wonder if Rory and Paul, I can just come to you for about a minute each on whether you think we are prepared, both in local authorities, but perhaps more broadly, for what this winter might bring. What have we learned? Let's start with Paul.
Thanks, Sarah. I think the experience, I think the structures are now in place to respond quicker, particularly with, like I mentioned, local resilience forums. I think they can, there was preparatory work done before the pandemic, but I think key contacts, all that learning has been embedded. I think we're in a better position. The point about long COVID, I would link that in terms of it. I'd broaden it away from just long COVID. I think it's also in terms, if you look at our economic inactivity stats, ill health is a real problem, particularly in South Yorkshire. Ours is much more pronounced than the rest of the country. And I think in terms of we're trying to tailor our employment support to help people with long-term health issues, both physical and mental. And there's, if people haven't heard of it, there's a pilot, a national pilot in South Yorkshire called Working Win, but trying to help people back into the labour market who have real health issues. And I think that needs to be a big focus nationally as well. So that'd be my answer.
Right, thank you. Rory?
I totally agree with Paul, and I think we've got some of those structures in place. I mentioned about our welcoming places, which are our network of warm spaces, where we're looking to roll out. We are rolling out COVID vaccines and flu vaccines through those channels, and we've just started a bit of a campaign around winter readiness as well, with frontline staff and with frontline volunteers in our voluntary sector and community sector across the borough. So I think that kind of multi-agency approach, which worked really well during the pandemic, we've tried to carry on with in order to be prepared for any kind of shock, I suppose, as much as as much as you can from a local government point of view, given that a lot of the levers are in central government control, but things like cost of living crisis, next wave of COVID or whatever might happen. So I think we've taken a lot of learning from the pandemic.
Brilliant. Thank you so much to all of you. What a fascinating discussion, and some really interesting common themes there, I think, about how the pandemic acted as both imperative and challenge, but also an impetus for change, and has delivered some silver linings, perhaps, in amidst all the crisis. I was also really struck by the idea of the virtual circle, so that the more you had to work together in order to deliver things, the more the collaboration was strengthened, and the better responses became across a whole swathe of policy areas. And I think some good exhortations there in terms of avoiding half-hearted devolution, in terms of being braver, thinking more bravely, but also in terms of people as key to place, and making more opportunities for community voice and citizen participation. Thank you so much to all our speakers, to Rory Sherwood-Parkin, to Paul Johnson, to Anthony Breach, and of course to Sigrun Clark and Thomas Morris for undertaking the research and talking us through it so beautifully. Please do read the report. It's well worth a read. We'll put the URL in the chat again if we haven't already, and we will be in touch with you all after the event with further material, including our feedback survey, and we would really love it if you could complete that, because it just helps to make future IPPO events much better. We're really keen to continue our programme of work engaging with local government. So if you have ideas for things IPPO could be doing, please get in touch with us. We have work coming up, including a systematic review on home energy change, which we'll be launching next month, a systems map looking at how we can convert office space to housing, a review on hybrid working and disabilities within an event in the new year, and also forthcoming work on innovation districts. So if you want to know more about that, or indeed let us know about anything you're up to, please do get in touch. We'd love to hear from you. But for now, thank you so much for coming to the event. Thank you for your questions. Thanks again to all our speakers, and have a really great rest of your afternoon. Thank you. Bye-bye.